For nearly 30 years, the royal palace of Lisbon echoed with screams every night, sounds so desperate that guards could hear them beyond the walls and servants refused to work near the royal chambers after dark. The woman behind those screams was not a prisoner or a madwoman locked in the dungeons. She was the Queen of Portugal herself, and by the time she died in 1816, she had spent more years screaming than she had spent ruling. This is the story of Maria I, who became the first woman to rule Portugal in her own right, only to watch grief destroy her mind piece by piece until nothing remained but anguish and madness. Maria was born in 1734 as the eldest daughter of King José I, raised in the rigid ceremonial world of the Portuguese court where every aspect of her life was determined by duty and tradition. She learned languages and diplomacy, absorbed the expectations placed on royal children, and understood from childhood that her existence served the state rather than herself. At 25, she married her uncle Pedro, a man twice her age, in a strategic union designed to keep power within the Braganza family. The marriage produced 6 children over the following years while Pedro served as her father's closest advisor and Maria prepared herself for the responsibilities that would eventually come. When her father died in 1777, she became the first woman to rule Portugal as Queen Regnant rather than Regent, ascending to the throne at 43 with all the authority and burden that came with absolute power. The early years of Maria's reign showed Portugal a competent monarch who took her responsibilities seriously and worked to maintain the reforms her father had established. She attended to government business daily, reviewing documents and receiving ministers, managing the complex relationships between crown and church that defined Portuguese politics, and presenting herself as a pious ruler who understood that her authority derived from God. The kingdom enjoyed relative stability during this period, with colonial trade providing wealth from Brazil and other territories, and Maria governed with the conservative approach expected of a Catholic monarch in the 18th century. She promoted education and commerce, supported the arts, and attempted to reduce some of the harsher aspects of colonial administration while maintaining Portugal's position as a significant European power despite being smaller and less wealthy than its neighbors. Her husband Pedro assisted her in managing affairs of state, providing counsel and support while she retained ultimate authority, and their eldest son José stood as heir to the throne, preparing himself to eventually rule just as Maria had once prepared. The rhythms of court life continued with established patterns of ceremony and ritual, marking religious festivals and state occasions while the machinery of government functioned smoothly beneath the surface. Maria's devotion to Catholicism had always been strong, and she attended Mass daily, consulted regularly with her confessors, and ensured that religious observance remained central to court life. Her subjects saw a queen who embodied the virtues they expected from their monarch, combining piety with practical governance, and for the first 9 years of her reign, nothing suggested that the stability she projected would ever be disrupted. But in 1786, her husband died suddenly, and this loss marked the beginning of changes that would gradually transform her from a functioning ruler into something else entirely. Pedro had been more than a consort, he had been her partner in managing the complex demands of sovereignty, someone who understood the pressures she faced and shared the burden of decisions that affected millions of lives across the Portuguese Empire. Maria mourned according to the elaborate customs that royalty demanded, wearing black and attending memorial services, commissioning masses for Pedro's soul and observing the proper period of withdrawal from public life. Court officials noticed that her religious devotions intensified after his death, that she spent longer hours in prayer and seemed increasingly preoccupied with questions of sin and divine judgment. Her confessors reported conversations where she expressed anxiety about whether her family might face heavenly punishment for actions taken during her father's reign, particularly his brutal suppression of the Jesuit order decades earlier and his seizure of church properties. These concerns seemed excessive but not yet alarming, the response of a deeply religious widow seeking reassurance about the afterlife, and her government continued functioning normally even as she withdrew somewhat from the social aspects of court. Ministers still received their audiences, documents still received her signature, and the daily business of ruling continued without significant disruption. 2 years passed with Maria maintaining this uneasy equilibrium between duty and grief, managing to perform her functions as queen while privately struggling with anxieties that her confessors could not entirely soothe. Then in 1788, her eldest son José died from smallpox at 27, and whatever stability she had preserved after Pedro's death began to crumble. José had been crowned prince, the heir upon whom the dynasty's future depended, trained from birth to eventually rule Portugal, and his death meant the succession passed to his younger brother Joao, who was less prepared for the responsibility. For Maria, this loss struck deeper than political calculation, violating her understanding of how the world should function, because parents are not supposed to bury their children, and when they do, the natural order itself seems broken. She had lost her husband, and now she had lost her son, and the combination of these deaths within 2 years created a conviction in her mind that God was punishing the house of Braganza for sins committed during her father's reign. Maria's behavior changed noticeably after José's death, becoming more erratic and withdrawn as she spent entire days in chapel or locked in her chambers, refusing meals and emerging only to attend government functions where she appeared distracted and tearful. Ministers found it increasingly difficult to conduct business with her, as she seemed unable to focus on affairs of state, more concerned with religious matters and the fate of her soul than with the practical demands of governing an empire. The composure that had characterized her early reign disappeared, replaced by visible anxiety that made courtiers uncomfortable and foreign ambassadors concerned about Portugal's stability. She began speaking about her dead son constantly, asking servants if they had seen him, claiming to hear his voice, and these incidents became frequent enough that her family started to worry that something more serious than grief was affecting her mind. Her confessor documented that she would sometimes cry out during religious exercises, calling for José and Pedro, demanding to know why God had taken them from her. In 1790, her youngest daughter Maria Francisca died at 21, adding another loss to the accumulated weight Maria carried, and her already fragile mental state deteriorated further. She now spent most of her time engaged in religious activities, attending multiple masses each day, praying for hours, consulting with priests about how to atone for sins she believed had brought divine punishment upon her family. Her participation in government became minimal, with ministers making decisions and simply presenting them for her signature, and even this limited involvement proved difficult because she often refused to see anyone. The palace began operating with a monarch who was present but not functional, whose authority still existed in legal terms but could not be exercised in practice, and discussions began among the royal family about what should be done if Maria became completely unable to rule. Her son Joao, now heir to the throne after his brother's death, was 23 years old and inexperienced, facing the prospect of assuming power while his mother still lived. When Maria's mother died in 1792, whatever remained of her mental stability shattered completely, transforming her from a troubled but occasionally functional monarch into someone who could no longer be considered capable of governing at all. The screaming began that year, terrible sounds that echoed through the palace at night, wordless expressions of anguish that continued for hours. Servants investigating found the queen in her chambers calling out for her dead family members, begging them to return, her voice growing hoarse and then breaking entirely from the strain. The screams became a regular occurrence, happening almost every night, loud enough that guards outside the palace could hear them, disturbing enough that servants began refusing assignments near the royal chambers after dark. When her voice gave out, Maria would begin striking her head against the walls, the sound of impact carrying through the corridors, and when attendants tried to restrain her, she would fight them with surprising strength, scratching at the walls until her fingernails wore down to bleeding stumps. The court physicians had no framework for understanding what was happening to Maria, living in an era when mental illness was interpreted through religious and humoral theory rather than scientific understanding. They prescribed bloodletting, believing that removing blood would balance her humors and calm her agitation, though this only weakened her physically without touching the psychological torment that drove her behavior. They ordered ice baths, plunging her into freezing water in the belief that shock would restore her reason, achieving nothing except adding physical suffering to her mental anguish. Religious authorities performed exorcisms, convinced that demonic possession explained her symptoms, and these rituals involved prayers and holy water and sometimes physical restraint when Maria became violent. Nothing worked because nothing they tried addressed the actual problem, which was that Maria's mind had broken under accumulated grief until it could no longer function in any recognizable way. Palace staff developed routines around Maria's condition, learning when the screaming was likely to start and making preparations, assigning guards to prevent her from injuring herself too severely while maintaining the pretense that everything was normal and the queen was simply ill. Visitors were told that Her Majesty was indisposed, suffering from a chronic condition that required rest and limited her ability to receive guests, and most people accepted these explanations without questioning too deeply. But the screams could not be hidden entirely, and rumors spread through Lisbon about the mad queen who wailed through the night, her voice carrying beyond the palace walls into the surrounding city where people whispered and crossed themselves when they passed the royal residence. The government continued functioning because ministers made decisions and Joao gradually assumed more responsibility, but the fiction that Maria remained sovereign became harder to maintain as months passed and her condition only worsened. By the end of 1792, it had become clear that Maria would not recover, and formal arrangements needed to be made for governing Portugal without her. Joao was declared Prince Regent, assuming his mother's powers while she remained technically queen, a legal fiction that preserved the monarchy's dignity while acknowledging that Maria could no longer rule. She was moved to more isolated quarters where her screaming would disturb fewer people, attended by a small staff who had grown accustomed to her condition and knew how to manage her violent episodes. The restraints became permanent, used every night to prevent her from injuring herself during the hours when her agitation peaked, and Maria spent her days either in stuporous silence or sudden episodes of frantic activity, never recovering even moments of lucidity. The woman who had once governed an empire now existed in a prison of her own broken mind, unable to understand where she was or why she suffered, trapped in an eternal present where her children had just died and her grief was always fresh. The physicians continued their useless treatments because they had nothing else to offer, and doing something felt better than admitting their complete helplessness. Maria's confessor kept detailed records of her symptoms, documenting the screaming that began after sunset and continued for hours, the periods where she would call out specific names, asking for Jose or Pedro or Maria Francisca, begging them to come to her, and then descending into wordless wailing that expressed suffering beyond language. He noted that she refused food for days at a time and had to be fed forcibly to prevent starvation, that she no longer seemed to recognize even her closest family members when they visited. The palace had become her asylum, and she its most tragic prisoner, a queen in title but in reality a broken woman whose mind had surrendered under pressures it could not bear. For the next 16 years, Maria existed rather than lived, maintained in a state of permanent madness while Portugal continued without her, the government functioning under Joao's regency and the queen herself becoming almost forgotten except as a source of disturbing sounds that reminded everyone of her presence. The screaming never stopped entirely, though it became less frequent as her voice permanently damaged from years of abuse, reducing her cries to hoarse whispers and croaking sounds that were somehow even more disturbing than the original screams. She aged rapidly under the strain of her condition, her hair turning white, her body becoming thin and frail from refusing food and from constant agitation that burned through whatever nutrition she received. Palace staff who attended Maria developed a professional detachment, treating her care as simply another duty rather than thinking too deeply about the tragedy they witnessed every day. Portugal during these years faced significant external pressures, particularly from Napoleon's expansion across Europe, and the fact that the kingdom continued functioning despite having a mad queen showed how thoroughly power had transferred to Joao and his ministers. In 1807, when French armies invaded Portugal as part of Napoleon's continental strategy, the decision was made to evacuate the royal family to Brazil rather than remain in Lisbon and risk capture. This massive undertaking involved moving the entire court across the Atlantic, transforming Rio de Janeiro into the temporary capital of the Portuguese Empire, and Maria was included in this evacuation despite her condition because leaving her behind was politically impossible. She was brought aboard ship still screaming and restrained, making the voyage in a specially prepared cabin where her cries could be somewhat contained. Those sailors reported hearing her throughout the journey, her voice mixing with the sounds of wind and waves. Brazil became Maria's final prison, though she likely had no awareness of the change in location or understanding that she had crossed an ocean. The royal family established themselves in Rio de Janeiro, setting up court in a tropical climate vastly different from Lisbon, and Maria was housed in quarters where her screaming would disturb as few people as possible. The Brazilian climate was thought by some physicians to possibly help her condition, but of course nothing changed because geography could not heal what was broken in her mind. She continued her patterns of screaming in silence, periods of violent agitation followed by exhausted calm, her days blending together into endless repetition of suffering that had long since lost any meaning beyond the immediate experience of pain and confusion. The Portuguese court in Brazil adapted to their exile, establishing the rhythms of government in new surroundings, and Maria became an increasingly marginal figure in her own kingdom, a queen who existed only as a title while her son ruled in everything but name. Visitors to the Brazilian court were rarely allowed to see her, the fiction of her illness maintained more strictly now that they were in a new location where fewer people knew the full truth. Official announcements would occasionally reference Her Majesty's health, always phrasing things carefully to suggest temporary indisposition rather than permanent madness, and this deception had become so routine that most people involved no longer thought about the tragedy they were concealing. Maria had become a state secret, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be helped. The final years of Maria's life blurred together in endless repetition of the same suffering she had experienced since 1792, her mind never clearing, her anguish never diminishing, the screaming continuing with whatever voice remained after decades of abuse. She had been mad for nearly a quarter century by the time she reached her 70s, longer than many of her subjects had been alive, and the younger generation of Portuguese nobility knew her only as the Mad Queen, having no memory of the competent ruler she had once been. Her son Joao governed in her name, signing documents as Prince Regent but wielding the full powers of monarchy, and the legal fiction of Maria's continued reign became increasingly absurd as years passed and she remained utterly incapable of any royal function. In 1816, Maria finally died at 81, her body simply giving out after decades of stress and poor nutrition and constant agitation that had worn it down to nothing. The screaming stopped not because her mind had healed but because she no longer had breath to produce sound. She died in Brazil, thousands of miles from the palace where her reign had begun, and the woman who was buried bore little resemblance to the queen who had once governed Portugal with competence and dignity. Official announcements described her death with appropriate solemnity, praising her piety and devotion, carefully avoiding any mention of the madness that had defined her final decades. Joao was crowned king at last, assuming the title he had already held in practice for 24 years, and the kingdom moved forward. Maria was remembered primarily for her madness rather than her accomplishments, the screaming queen whose anguish had echoed through palace corridors for 3 decades. Modern understanding would recognize her symptoms as consistent with severe depression and psychosis, possibly bipolar disorder or another major mental illness triggered by accumulated trauma and grief, conditions that might have been manageable with appropriate treatment but in the early 19th century were simply incomprehensible disasters that people could only witness and contain. She had lost her husband, then 2 sons, then her daughter, then her mother, each loss compounding the previous ones until her mind could no longer bear the weight, and when it broke completely and permanently. The palace in Lisbon stood as a monument to her reign, its corridors having witnessed both her competent governance and her descent into madness, and servants who had worked there during her final years would tell stories about the screaming for decades afterward. Her story became a cautionary tale about the fragility of the human mind, about how even the most privileged and powerful could be destroyed by grief and loss, about the helplessness of medicine before mental illness in an era that lacked even the vocabulary to describe what they were witnessing. She had been the first woman to rule Portugal in her own right, a distinction that should have made her historically significant, but instead she was remembered for her tragedy, for screaming that lasted 3 decades, for a mind that broke so completely that it could never be repaired. The screaming stopped in 1816 when Maria's body finally failed, bringing silence to rooms that had known nothing but anguish for nearly a quarter century, but the memory of those screams persisted long after she was buried, becoming part of Portuguese history not as battles or treaties are remembered but as a haunting, a reminder that some kinds of suffering cannot be escaped through power or privilege or prayer, and that sometimes the human mind simply breaks under pressures it was never designed to withstand.